Good morning, friends. Hope you're all fine. Let us continue our discussion on Marxism and international relations. Yesterday we had a preliminary round of understanding international relations from the Marxian perspective, how Marxian perspectives themselves are different from one school to the other. You have the classical Marxist position, neo-Marxist position of the Frankfurt School, the traditions of Antonio Gramsci, Lukács, Karl Korsch and others. You have structural Marxists like Althusser and others, and several similar traditions of Marxian understanding of international relations like that. Today our focus is on how Gramsci has made an impact on studies of international relations, how Gramscian perspective has influenced, has made a deeper impact on the studies of international relations like that. Those who have applied Gramscian perspectives in international relations are sometimes called neo-Gramscians. Maybe for the reason that Gramsci didn't talk much about international relations, rather some of his perspectives which had a relevance to a particular European situation, particularly the situation in Italy, could have been extended and modified and applied in the context of international relations. That would have been the reason why that they are called neo-Gramscians. You have a number of scholars being called as neo-Gramscians, but our focus is entirely on the studies by Robert Cox, who is called a critical theorist of international relations, belonging to the Gramscian tradition. So before we discuss Robert Cox's understanding of international relations, his perspectives of international relations, let us have a brief understanding of what Gramsci has talked about all these things. As I told you, much of what we call as a neo-Gramscian perspective in international relations or critical theory tradition of Robert Cox is based on the work of the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, who lived in the last decade of the 19th century and early part of the 20th century. He died in 1937. Gramsci was one of the important founding members of the Italian Communist Party. As you would be knowing that he was arrested by the fascist party in Italy. Mussolini's government imprisoned him in 1926 for his political activities, and he spent the rest of his time in prison. And it was from the prison that he wrote several what we call perspectives on state society, civil society, and several other things. And that came to be edited or assembled in the form of a volume called Prison Notebooks. If you read Prison Notebooks, you can find several chapters dealing with all these things. Perhaps the most important question that that posed I think many scholars of that time, including Antonio Gramsci, was that why no communist revolution took place in Western Europe as anticipated by, foretold by Marx and some of his colleagues at that time. Why was it so difficult to promote revolution in Western Europe and like that? Of course, Marx had predicted that revolution and transition to socialism would take place first in the advanced capitalist countries, then move to other countries. But you know that revolution took place in a comparatively backward country like Russia. So he asked this question, what went wrong in Europe? Gramsci's answer to this question basically revolves around his use of the concept of hegemony, which has become so prominent in our discourses today, particularly in international relations. It is most frequently used to explain the most powerful country or the state in the global system or international system. So Gramsci's use of concept of hegemony is very much related to his understanding of power, which is broader and richer than the concept of power developed by realists or neo-realists. Perhaps Gramsci's concept of power is a combination of two important categories, which we understand from the perspective of coercion and consent. Coercion and consent. We may simply explain it in terms of as a kind of force being applied on the one hand, and the second is again a kind of an agreement. Consent in the form of an agreement. You are agreeing to something like that. That's why. So coercion and consent are critical in understanding the concept of hegemony in Gramsci. So how does he explain this coercion and consent? If you go back to the writings of Machiavelli is the most famous book, The Prince. Look at the chapter 18. You can find a particular figure called Centaur in chapter 18, wherein you have a kind of a figure maybe half human being and half horse-like animal and like that. And I think it's a sort of it's a combination of how force and cunningness operate and things like that. So in understanding how the existing order, prevailing order is maintained, Marxists generally, the classical Marxists generally focus on almost exclusively on the coercive practices from the point of view of use of force and capabilities of the state and how violence is exercised and like that. In that perspective, state is essentially seen as a means of oppressing one class by another, and the dominant class always uses force and like that. That's the classical understanding of a classical Marxist understanding of what you call as hegemony or use of violence and things like that. So it was coercion that would prevent the exploited society from rising up and changing the system that makes them suffer. So it is through this exercise of force that powerful states control and maintain order. That's a traditional concept of Marxism or things like that. But Gramsci's concept is entirely different. He interpreted hegemony differently. While this was true, maybe in the context of hegemony, this was true in less developed countries like Russia. It was not the case in the Western Europe, Gramsci says. Here the system was maintained not merely by coercion, by use of force, but also through consent. How consent is generated, how consent is created is very important. By hegemony of the ruling class in society. Hegemony is not simply force alone. Hegemony has two combinations. It's a combination of both coercion and consent. So hegemony makes the political, cultural and moral values of the dominant group to become widely dispersed throughout the society, and that will be accepted by subordinate groups and classes as their own particular things and like that. And for Gramsci, the dominant ideologies are institutionalized in society as they become the common sense. So the dominant ideologies are not simply superimposed on people through force. It's also through consent. That's the idea that he puts across. It is in this context that his concept of civil society is so prominent. Civil society, he explains from the point of view of the network of institutions and practices in society that enjoy some autonomy from the state, and through which groups and individuals organize, represent, and express themselves to each other and to the state. And these groups or entities include media, educational system, churches, religious institutions in general, voluntary organizations, trade unions, political parties, all. So it is here that Gramsci tries to relocate superstructure. Here superstructure should be emphasized because although the structure of society may be a reflection of social relations of production in the economic base, superstructure, which we call as political and cultural practices, the superstructure determines whether the society is subject to change, prone to change and transform itself. And here Gramsci puts across a very interesting concept. I do not know whether you have already heard about this concept. The concept of historic block. Historic block, not historical block, historic block. Historic block implies a relation between the cultural and the political and economic. Also, I think kind of a combination of the cultural, political, and economic practices on relationships, which requires an organic link between people and the intellectuals, organic link between the people and the governors and the governed, leaders and the led, and things like that. How this organic relationship is established is very critical. So he says that the historic block somewhat reflects the way in which leading social forces within a specific national context establish a relationship over contending social forces. Maybe you can say that this is a very complicated network of relationship. Historic block in that sense is defined as a situation in which various classes and factions of them are related, and implicitly one mode of production is dominant in that particular way. And here you have to find that maybe the forces which are involved in this process of making of historic block, they may not be aware that this link is established, and this link is maybe established through maybe not necessarily through a conscious effort and like that, but it is through linkages in one form or the sharing of ideas, sharing of certain practices, and so on and so forth. So that's the reason why that Gramsci used to say that if at all you have to smash the state or the repressive apparatus of the state, you have to have a sort of counter hegemonic struggle. It's not that necessarily that you have to have a class struggle, the working class struggle against the oppressors and like that. It should be a kind of a counter hegemonic struggle that should happen in civil society itself. If the hegemony of the ruling class is a key element in the perpetuation of its dominance, then society can only be transformed if that hegemonic position is successfully challenged. And this demands, as Gramsci said, a counter-hegemonic struggle in civil society, in which the prevailing hegemony is undermined, allowing an alternative historic bloc to be constructed. That's why he said that capitalist countries in Europe, West European capitalist countries in Europe were quite successful in perpetuating their hegemony and thereby continuing with the capitalist form of production because of this possibility of historic block linked established over a period of time between the state and civil society, between civil society institutions and networks and so on and so forth. So unless the revolution should happen not necessarily with the leadership of one revolutionary party, but you have to ensure that all the civil society agents are equally important in the process of counter-hegemonic struggle. Otherwise, nothing would happen. If you don't have a civil society wherein counter-hegemonic struggle is not possible, revolution may not be possible. So what is possible could be a kind of a hegemony of the oppressed, oppressive ideology or oppressive classes in that way. So where comes the importance of Gramsci's concept of hegemony and concept of civil society. So I would have told you already that in many contexts, Gramsci used to argue that the success of a capitalist state lies in its ability to manage not only the problems of society through the use of force, but also through a process of consent making. Even the people who are opposing the state policies and programs are made to agree with the policies and perspectives of the state through an alternative channel like that. So say for example, if you have these alternative channels in civil society operating, like for example education institutions, churches, voluntary agencies, NGOs and like that, they will become the agents of the state in a significant way, thereby through these agents of civil society or agencies of civil society, the state will get the consent to rule, and that's why that their hegemony is possible. Hegemony is possible in the sense that its rule is perpetuated through these activities in the civil society index. So civil society from the perspective of Gramsci at that point of time is very critical in terms of playing a kind of an important role in the perpetuation of dominance, hegemony of the most important party in power, which has control over the means of production and so on and so forth. So this notion you have to keep in mind when you understand Robert Cox critical theory of international relations like that. I think my brief introduction to Gramsci should be supplemented with additional readings, some of which I think I can send through email or by this telegram messages and like that. Should have a thorough understanding of how Gramsci has developed all these things. You might have heard about many of his concepts, like the concept of subaltern and other things in other contexts and like that. But these two concepts of hegemony and historic bloc are very important in the making of an international order, or maybe a world order or disorder, whatever it is. So that's the focus of Robert Cox analysis. So let me tell you that Robert Cox became a well-known IR scholar right from 1980s onwards. A Canadian IR scholar who died only last year. You would have read a brief obituary that I have written on Robert Cox in some of the web portals like that. I can forward a copy of it. Keep in mind that Robert Cox, he introduced Gramsci to the study of world politics or international relations in a very different way. He criticized mostly the prevailing theories of international relations, particularly the realist and neo-realist theories. And also he critiqued the international political economy theories of a particular school, and he tried to develop an alternative framework for the analysis of international relations. One of the most pioneering, maybe you can say seminal articles of Robert Cox was written way back in 1981. I can send a copy of the article for your reading. The title of the article is this: Social Forces, States and World Orders Beyond International Relations Theory. This was published in 1981. So most important aspect of this particular article, I think perhaps that was the beginning of a new series of studies in post-positivist writings of IR from a critical theory point of view. He says that if ideas and values are a reflection of a particular set of social relations, if ideas and values are a reflection or a representation of a particular set of social relations and are transformed as those relations themselves are transformed, then this suggests that all knowledge must reflect a certain context, a certain time, and a certain space. In other words, knowledge from that point of view cannot be universal. Knowledge from that point of view cannot be objective and timeless, as neo-realists argue. Neo-realists like Kenneth Waltz argued like that. It was hardly 2 years since Kenneth Waltz wrote his book Theory of International Politics in 1979. This article emerged in 1981. And for Cox, this particular sentence is oft-quoted sentence in all international relations theory textbooks like that. Cox says that theory is always for someone and for some purpose. The classical positivists used to argue that theory is always value neutral. Theory is always ethically neutral, and therefore if you say that you have a theory, it's universally applicable and so on and so forth in social sciences, not in science in that sense. But here you have a kind of an argument that theory is always for someone and for some purpose. Realists claim to describe the world as it is, which we discussed in detail in several sessions on realism and neo-realism, as it is and as it always will be. But in fact, they are perpetuating, they are reinforcing the ruling hegemony in the current world order. If you look at the realist and neo-realist theories, the most important beneficiaries of all these theories are the most dominant powers, the most hegemonic powers of the world system. So that's why there's this critique. And Cox attempts to develop a sort of an emancipatory theoretical understanding of world order. Emancipatory theoretical understanding of world order. That is, the purpose is to liberate the world from such politically prejudiced, what we call theories and so on and so forth. So this attempt is seeks to emphasize both the sources of stability in a given system, also the dynamics of the process of transformation. So one of the most important considerations of realist and neo-realist perspectives is that how stability is maintained in international system, how systems get transformed from one level to the other and like that. Here you have a kind of a challenge of how this stability is established, how this stability is maintained, how the stability is disturbed, and that particular aspect is taken up for discussion, detailed discussion by Robert Cox. So Cox actually benefits from Gramsci's concept of hegemony, and he transfers it to the international realm, international relations context. Hegemony is important for maintaining stability according to the traditional concept of it. So how to transform the world is very critical here. So Cox says that successive dominant powers in the international system, they have shaped the world order that fits in with or that suits their interests. And they have done so not only as a result of their coercive capabilities, use of force, but also because they managed to generate broad consent for that order, even among the disadvantaged sections of international system, disadvantaged groups or entities in international system. So the dominant powers, they perpetuate their domination, hegemony, not only through force, but also through consent. That's why there is both the exercise of this both coercion and consent as a combination is very critical in Gramscian as well as in Coxian understanding of international relations. So he asks this question very prominently in the context of free trade and so on and so forth. He says that the hegemons like Britain and the US, they use this as hegemonic idea of free trade throughout the 19th and 20th century and even after that. So they claim that this system benefits everyone, and therefore it has been so widely accepted that it has attained common sense status. Maybe you can ask this question whether President Trump accepts this logic or not. That's a different point. I think he takes a different route in rationalizing this hegemony, but without undermining the very essentials of free trade. He's not actually against free trade, but he is accepting free trade to the extent to which it benefits the United States, like that. So the concept of free trade has been made a popular, a kind of a common sense over a period of time as a result of the way in which it has been made possible for other countries to accept it, and so on and so forth. So free trade in that sense benefits the hegemonic power, as it is the most efficient producer in the global economy, and it can produce goods which are competitive in all markets and like that. So the peripheral countries, the countries in the third world or currently the global south countries, they do not benefit from free trade as much as the hegemon does, or as much as the big powers of the global north countries benefit. But Marx has argued free trade actually prevents the development of the periphery. Like you would have already known that scholars like Gunther Frank, Samir Amin, Emmanuel Wallerstein, all these neo-Marxists argued like that. Free trade in that sense actually prevented the development of the global south, the periphery, or the satellites that way. So the power of the US is based on the hegemony of a particular concept of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism has become so prominent with this. So neoliberal policies are accepted as a norm throughout the world, particularly in the context of a new form of equation after 1991. You have within this concept of neoliberalism a set of policies most closely associated with the neoliberal project, that is privatization, reduction of state spending, liberalization of trade and capital, and these policies are also known as Washington Consensus. Perhaps we have already discussed some of these aspects in different contexts. What this Washington Consensus is, the role played by what we call as the US Treasury on the one hand, and the most important institutions like Bretton Woods institutions like IMF, World Bank, and subsequently the World Trade Organization, how these institutions play an important role in the making of a particular world order, from the point of view of the fact that many countries who were even critical of the role of these institutions have become members of these bodies, and therefore you have become a kind of a willing partner in the process of global hegemony and like that. So the adoption of the neoliberal policies by global south countries is a classical example of that, and their spending on health and education all decreased over a period of time. Not only the first world countries, but even the second world, third world countries like India, or global south countries like India, spending on health and education. You may be knowing that in the current context of this pandemic, people have been asking this question whether the spending of 1.15% of the total GDP is sufficient enough to maintain a proper healthcare system in this country like that. I think the government is now forced to rethink its health policy in the context of this global pandemic and like that. So these global south countries are forced to rely more on the export of raw materials and import manufactured goods of developed countries and like that. A sort of a new exchange relations has taken place and like that. Interestingly, you will find that over a period of time, even countries in the global south, say for example countries like India, started talking more about globalization, the inevitability of globalization, even at a time when the global north countries themselves have become more critical of globalization. The countries like India have been arguing, you might be knowing that in the Global Economic Forum, uh, only countries like India and China argued for intensive or intensified globalization, while United and some other countries like Britain were critical of the limits to globalization and things like that. So, as global South countries devalued their currency as part of neoliberal policies, the price of their exported raw materials decreased considerably. So, global South countries privatize their public enterprises. Uh, Perhaps at that time, American or European companies buy them at their relatively cheap prices and like that. So, if neoliberal policies have such a negative results, why global South countries adopted it so widely? This is a question that we have to pose in the present context. Robert Cox has written so much on it till his death in 2018. He says that coercion, from the point of view of a debt crisis between the global South and the West in the 1970s and 1980s, could be understood from this point of view. This debt crisis resulted from excessive and unwise lending by Western banks. We were forced to take loans from these institutions. And the global South countries are unable to pay even the interest of these debts, leave alone the capital, and also the debt itself, the debt in the sense of paying back their money like that. So they applied to IMF for assistance, for further servicing and things like that. It's a kind of vicious circle that once you take a loan, you cannot get over it. You have to take another loan to pay the interest of it. So in order to receive money from the IMF, they had to implement as a part of this project, you have to implement neoliberal policies and so on and so forth. So you find that it has become a kind of a policy package of many of these global South countries to accept the norms and conditions and regulations put across by the global South, global North institutions, particularly IMF, World Bank, WTO, and even US Treasury from that point of view. Generally, the the Washington consensus. The consensus, the word consensus itself is a kind of an indication how it has become so hegemonic in the sense that many countries have accepted through the policy packages of global structural adjustment programs and like that. So you find that Gramsci had shifted the focus of Marxist analysis towards superstructural phenomena. When you talk about superstructural phenomena, you have a large number of institutions, social forces and things like that. Gramsci, he explored the processes by which consent for a particular social and political system was produced through the operation of hegemony. So hegemony in that sense allows the ideas of the ruling elite to become widespread. How it has become so what we call so available, distributed across is very important. So Cox attempted to internationalize Gramsci's thought by transferring his concepts such as hegemony to the global context and like that. At a later stage, Robert Cox became critical of the role of neoliberal institutions, neoliberal world order. He even anticipated that sooner or later neoliberal world order will be forced to change, forced to these so-called northern countries, I think global north countries will have to revisit all these things once you have a troubled time. Some change called self-organization at a global level is inevitable according to him. From that point of view, in that sense, the world economic crisis that started way back in 2007-8 could be a kind of a reminder, a kind of a warning to all countries. And each crisis becomes a great advantage because it shows that global capitalism has inevitably failed to run in its own way and things like that. Anyway, in the current context of what we call as the global pandemic, COVID-19, many countries have understood one important point that you have the spread of coronavirus so widespread, so fast in growing economies, particularly in the global north countries, where you have integration, market integration, social integration, cultural integration, and all these things were so intense. And perhaps connectivity was so heightened and intensified. And from that point of view, you have a kind of a crisis happening in one part of the world, you have the entire crisis being spread over. This is the entire result of this. So whether it actually started in China or in some other countries, that's immaterial here. The problem is it's widespread. I mean, it's spread across the world. How fast it is, how dangerous it is, and these things are important from the point of view of its the globe. The problem is that if the same pandemic had taken place in China way back in early 1970s, the world would not have faced such a kind of trouble for the simple reason that the connectivity of China with the outside world was so thin, was so not important from the point of view of making it possible for all other countries to spread it like that. You have seen that even scholars like David Harvey and many others arguing that just becomes so fast and so intensified, maybe kind of because of the gravity of the situation. It's wherever you have this integration, intensified market logic of functioning and connectivity of the people travel around and all these things happening, definitely you have the fall inevitable. It's not that countries like India or countries in Africa and Latin America are not going to face it. They will have to face it at some level, at some point of time, maybe in one degree or in another degree. But the level of impact or the intensity could be different from one country to another from the point of view of the connectivity point. I think the circuit routes are very important today like that. Just imagine the situation. This is a virus, a kind of a biological virus. I mean, maybe you can say that it's a sort of a virus that travels from one biological system to another biological system, and like that it can undermine the existence of the entire biological world order in one way or other. Just imagine that if this happens in a different way in our global communication network. Now we are all, in spite of this global pandemic, we are all connected together in a different way. That's why that I speak to you. I can offer a lecture to you and you can listen and you can take notes sitting at home and things like that. If this happens, along with that, if a virus of a different sort attacks this entire communication system in one part of the world, definitely the entire world will be in danger, because it's not only that connectivity is lost, but you have all kinds of things are lost, like for example markets, communication routes, and you won't be able to know what is happening where, how things are not there. I think we are all now in a world of ideas being exchanged from one level to the other because of this connectivity. So whoever is critical of the world capitalist system or the current dispensation of what we call they cannot be critical of the current technological order. You can say that this technology order is such that even without human beings in interaction physically, they can have interaction otherwise, which is made possible through this connectivity and like that. That's why that this consent is crucially important. I think in the current phase of our crisis, what is more important is that the global connectivity through this ICT, information communication technology, is so hegemonic in the sense that this hegemony is acceptable to all, because that we are all in a position to communicate to each other and to know each other, to know the intensity of the problem and all these things. That's how that hegemony is understood from the point of view of international relations. But remember, Coxian understanding is basically critical of the way the world capitalist system is delivering good to the people, delivering what is called all kinds of things, not only goods and services, but also all kinds of opportunities available and like that. Cox is critical of this global neoliberal world order for two reasons. He was actually uh, he was actually underlining the importance of how a welfare state model is better than this neoliberal world order from the point of view of taking care of the problems of the marginalized, the peripheralized sections of the population like that. And perhaps some scholars now, right, in the current context of this pandemic also became critical of the role of neoliberal world order, wherein the considerable downsizing of the public, uh, public good or whatever in call is public institutions. They're saying that the intensity of the problem, current problem, cannot be resolved without the active intervention of the state institutions and public policy interventions and things like that. It's not only that you have World Health Organization functioning in a remote part of the world and sending ideas and information to all parts of the world. That I think they are only transmitting ideas and information passing from one level to the other, but to benefit people, if they have to benefit from this, nation states will have to transform all these ideas and practices into in a different form of intervention strategies, and that only state can do with the help of institutions like public institutions, like including the law and order agencies, health agencies, administrative apparatuses, and like that. So this is crucially important in our understanding of the world. It's not that the role of the state has gone. The role of the state has come back today from the point of view of the role that the state is expected to exercise, play in a crisis context like that. No crisis in this world can be resolved without the participation of both the state and civil society in that way. So you have to generate a new form of consent from the global system, from the particular nation states, from the state, from the civil society, from agencies of civil society to combat a particular threat in the current context like that. This is a very important logic that we have to develop from the Gramsci notion. It's not only that the state is important, it is equally important that the civil society plays a secondary role that the state is expected to play, whether it is hegemonic or not. Maybe you can argue that maybe tomorrow the World Health Organization will come up with an alternative, a solution to this problem with a vaccine being developed, and you'll have to accept that this is important for the world to survive. And this is maybe you can say that some sort of business matters, business interests matter in the making of a vaccine, or business pharmaceutical industries like that. And some agencies even critique the role of such agencies like WHO, for example, in the popularization of a particular vaccine like that. But the world has understood through engaging such what you call pandemic and crisis in the past with very conscious efforts in terms of eradicating diseases like that. We cannot say that science cannot be cannot be expected to play that kind of role. Science is very important today. We cannot say that science is so bad. I think if science is not available today, what would have been the fate of the world and like that? So the Coxian analysis is in that sense very important from the point of view of understanding the global hegemony of a particular order and how it is perpetuated and reperpetuated, how these institutions are critically important in the making of these studies and like that. Friends, I'm summing up my lecture today. I'll be sending a few articles and original articles written by Robert Cox, as well as comments and commentaries by others, which will supplement my lecture. This is a very short lecture, very brief, but I have pointed out the essential aspects, the essential features or characteristics of Robert Cox critical theory of international relations, like that. Have a good day.